At the end of the Second World War, one of the most disgusting and shocking war criminals disappeared. He vanished under the noses of the Allies without a trace. The soldiers learned about the name Rudolf Höss from the prisoners and survivors of Auschwitz, the deadliest single site of slaughter of the war. As the conflict came to an end in Europe, many of the most notorious men and women tried to escape the impending justice and trials that would come their way. Some fled to South America down rat lines, but others knew that they stood a relatively good chance of evading capture if they just hid it out under the noses of their enemies. Rudolf Höss, the former commandant of Auschwitz, the man who built the camp from the ground up, did just that. His wife and children were sent one way, and the man who was responsible for over 1 million people's deaths disappeared into a small rural community, a small German town, under a false name. But his arrest eventually took place, with his wife being the one who gave over the vital information to the British about her husband's location. But the arrest ordeal wasn't simple. It required a skilled group of special forces tasked with hunting down notorious Nazis, but the seizure of Höss very easily could have resulted in his death. This is the hunt for the Commandant of Auschwitz. Rudolf Höss was rotten from a very young age. He was a veteran soldier of the First World War, and he lied about his age to join the fighting. He became, at 17 years old, the youngest non-commissioned officer in the army, and was wounded a number of times. Receiving the Iron Cross First Class, he was in his teenage years the commander of a cavalry unit, but at the end of the First World War he got involved in different nationalist groups. He was involved in attacks against Polish people, and on the 31st of May 1923, inside the town of Mecklenburg, Höss and other members of the right-wing paramilitary group the Freikorps beat a schoolteacher to death, upon the orders of Martin Bormann, the man who later became the private secretary of Adolf Hitler. Höss was locked up for the murder, but was released, and afterwards he met his wife. Hedwig Hensel was a member of the Arteman League, a group that promoted a back-to-the-fields rural lifestyle in the growing industrious Germany, and the pair hit it off very quickly. They married, and then a year later after their meeting, their eldest son was born. Hedwig, at the time of her marriage, would not know that she was going to be married to one of the most destructive mass murderers of the 20th century, but she was the one whose words led decades later to her husband's capture. Rudolf Höss joined the Nazi Party and the SS, and he was quickly noticed by the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. The pair became very good friends, and Höss continued to rise throughout the ranks of the paramilitary group. He worked at various different concentration camps in the 1930s, being a block leader at Dachau, and actually leading the firing squads that would execute people. He was the man who ordered the firing squad to shoot when the first conscientious objector, after the start of World War II, was executed inside Sachsenhausen concentration camp. He was a brutal man, and he ordered all prisoners at the site to stand outside in almost minus 30 degrees cold weather one evening, and many prisoners died because of this. But barbaric beasts like Höss were championed inside the SS, and he was sent by Heinrich Himmler on a special mission to investigate the establishment and possibility of creating a concentration camp in western Poland. Since the Nazis began their occupation of the country, they were looking at ways of punishing the Polish population and massacring many of them. In forests and in concealed areas, groups were being shot in their thousands. They were forced to dig their own graves before taking their final breaths. Höss arrived and inspected the area he had been ordered to around the town of Osisem. It was an old army barracks, and Höss referred to the town in its German name, Auschwitz. Höss found the site a good place to establish a new concentration camp, and Himmler said to him, "Go and make me that camp," with Höss being made the commandant. To begin with, he was ordered to make a transition camp for 10,000 prisoners, but Höss wanted to do things differently at Auschwitz, and he was obsessed with making the most destructive yet efficient site of mass slaughter within the Third Reich. As soon as the inmates arrived at Auschwitz, Höss reigned over them with brutality. He ordered his guards to execute and beat inmates to death. He established specialist torture blocks such as Block 11, where prisoners were subjected to horrifying treatment, and set up the death wall, a firing range where inmates were executed against the concrete after being stripped. He began to test ways of mass murder at the site after being given orders regarding the final solution. At Auschwitz, some prisoners even died in sick experiments, having grenades thrown at them in large pits, but this didn't work well, with Höss overseeing this, and human flesh was often found hanging in the trees of the surrounding forest. Höss settled on gassing after another SS officer fell asleep in his car, which was left running in a garage, and he almost died from this. He personally oversaw the trials of gas inside specific rooms at the camp, and eventually 4 huge gas chambers were constructed inside the expanded area of Auschwitz II Birkenau. Höss later wrote about his killing process that, and I quote, "Technically the killing wasn't so hard. It would not have been hard to exterminate even greater numbers. The killing itself took the least time. You could dispose of 2,000 heads in half an hour. But it was the burning that took all the time. The killing was easy. You didn't even need guards to drive them into the chambers. They just went in, expecting to take showers, and instead of water, we turned on poison gas. The whole thing went very quickly." Through the gas chambers and shootings carried out around the camp, at least 1.1 million people were killed at Auschwitz, the camp Höss created. All of this was happening whilst his wife and children were living directly next door to the camp in a lavish villa. They had servants and slaves, prisoners brutalised by the Höss family. Even the children battered those who performed work at the house. His wife would later claim that Rudolf Höss would be able to become the perfect father whilst he was at home, leaving his destructive day at work behind him. But inside Auschwitz his brutality continued, but in 1943 he was sacked, as it was said that he had an affair with a female prisoner. He was later recalled to the site in summer 1944 to oversee Operation Höss, the mass gassing and killing of 430,000 Hungarian Jews, who were slaughtered in just 56 days. Most were shot at the site, and the camp, including the gas chambers and the crematoria, could not cope with the sheer amount of people being killed. His final job inside the SS was at Ravensbrück, an all-female site relatively close to Berlin, where he was tasked with setting up the gas chambers. Inside them, 2,000 women lost their lives. But Höss knew what was happening in the Second World War at the time. The Germans were losing ground heavily, and it was clear that the conflict would soon come to an end in the favour of the Allies. He had been briefed by Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and one of his close personal friends, on what to do at the end of the war, and Höss was given a cyanide capsule to bring his life to an end if he was captured. He carried this around with him daily just in case. He was also told to keep false papers and use a false identity. As the war was coming to a conclusion in 1945, Rudolf Höss went on the run. In his autobiography, he wrote about what happened. He said, and I quote, "We went first, all towards the Dars. Then after 2 days, we headed for Schleswig-Holstein. All this was in accordance with the orders of the Reichsführer SS, as in Himmler. What we were supposed to do for him, or what duties we were still intended to perform, we could not imagine. I had to look after Frau Eicher, the wife of Theodor Eicher, another SS mass murderer, and her daughter and children, and other families, and see they did not fall into the hands of the enemy. Our flight was a gruesome journey. We travelled by night without lights, along roads crowded with vehicles moving bumper to bumper. I had to be constantly on the lookout to see that all our lorries remained together. In Rostock, 2 of my large lorries containing all the wireless equipment broke down. For days on end we sheltered from one clump of trees to the next, for the enemy's low-lying planes were continually machine-gunning this principal escape route. At the time the Allies were learning about the name Rudolf Höss. For months Auschwitz had been liberated, but the different Allied nations were searching prisoners for the former Commandant of Auschwitz. They knew that he would be under an alias or a false name. Höss continued to write about his flight that, in Wismar, Keitel himself stood in the street arresting deserters from the front. On the way we heard in a farmhouse that the Führer was dead. Was there any point in going on living? I had obtained some poison for my wife. Nevertheless, because of the children, we did not do this. The family split up around the area of Flensburg. Höss's wife and children remained. It's believed at some point that Höss may have met up with Himmler again, as he documented his last meeting with bizarre words. He claimed that Himmler stated, "Well, gentlemen, this is the end. You know what you have to do." At this point, Höss assumed his identity fully, the false name Franz Lang. He planned to head north to the Isle of Sylt and then pose as a member of the Naval Intelligence School. He sent his wife and children in the other direction. He tried to make himself inconspicuous, but then he heard about Himmler's capture and death, and he decided to try and live out life closer to his family. This must have been a pivotal moment for Rudolf Höss, the man who he had worshipped more than Hitler, Himmler, and the man who he was close friends with, was captured and now dead, despite all the resources at his disposal. He knew that the Allies would soon come for him, but he had another plan. The Naval Intelligence School he was hoping to get towards was moved as the Allies captured lands, and the SS men were moved from their zone and were sent to the Frisian Islands, making Höss's journey much trickier. At this time he still saw his family every few days, and living under his false name, he obtained work as a farmer. He said that, and I quote, "I passed through all the British control points without difficulty, and was sent by the Labour Office to work on a farm near Flensburg, specifically inside the town of Gottrupel. I liked the work, and I was completely independent, for the farmer was still being held by the Americans. I worked there for 8 months, with the help of my wife's brother, who worked in Flensburg. I was still able to keep in touch with my wife. I learned through my brother-in-law that I was being hunted by the British Field Security Police. I also heard they were keeping a close watch on my family, and reportedly searched the house." The truth was that Hedwig Höss and her family had been taken into British custody. Specifically, the British government's No. 1 War Crimes Investigations team were leading the interrogation, and to begin with, Hedwig and the children gave over no information about the whereabouts of Rudolf Höss. They obviously knew what he was doing, as they managed to see him regularly. The man who led the interrogations was Hans Alexander, a German Jew who had left Germany in 1936, and he became a Nazi hunter. Alexander knew he could get at Höss's wife. After an unsuccessful interrogation of Höss's daughter, Bridget, things turned nasty. She later claimed that the British soldiers began to strike and beat Klaus, the oldest son, and it was with this that Hedwig Höss then gave over the information. But the authorities had learned of one vital piece of information. On the wedding ring of Höss's wife, inside, inscribed with the names Hedwig and Rudolf intertwined. They knew that this would be on Rudolf Höss's ring, and that if he was found, this could be the vital piece of intelligence which confirmed to the British that they had their man. Now, Höss claimed that 2 days before his arrest, on the 11th of March 1946, that his cyanide capsule, given to him by Himmler, had actually broken. The British now knew, on a farm in Gottrupel, that Rudolf Höss, the former commandant, was working. They made their way over there. One of the men who arrested him wrote of the preparations to take Höss that, and I quote, "Rifles were checked and supplies loaded into the trucks, blankets, a field radio, cartons of extra ammunition. A box of axe handles was stashed into the back of one of the vehicles. Hans meanwhile put a call into the commander of Field Security Section 318, explaining the mission and requesting additional backup. He also arranged for a doctor from the 5th Royal Horse Artillery Regiment to join them. 2 hours later, the small convoy of trucks and jeeps hurried along the narrow roads towards Gottrupel. Darkness had descended on the German countryside. Inside the vehicles, 25 men sat nervously on benches, fidgeting with their gear. Hans knew that they all wanted to be in on the kill. It was pitch black and utterly quiet when the convoy rolled into the farmyard in Gottrupel at 11 o'clock on March 11th, 1946. Getting out of his jeep and accompanied by the medical officer and the driver, Hans ordered the others to hold back. He walked towards the barn and knocked loudly. Now, the capture of Rudolf Höss was, let's say, rough. He claimed in his own words that, I quote, "When I was aroused from my sleep, and I thought at first I was being attacked by robbers, for many robberies were taking place at that time. This was how they managed to arrest me. I was maltreated by the Field Security Police." He did miss out a few details though. Alexander's British forces set upon him and seized him. There were roughly 20 of them, stood opposite with their guns drawn. One of them thrust a pistol in Höss's mouth, and he was searched for cyanide capsules. A doctor searched him thoroughly, and then the all-clear was given. Höss then handed over his documents outlining his name of Franz Lang, and using a photograph that the British had obtained, they tried to identify him, but Höss looked a little bit more withered and old. They searched for his SS blood group tattoo, but there was nothing. But Hans Alexander then demanded the wedding ring. Höss claimed it was stuck on, and Alexander said he had cut off his finger if he didn't surrender it. When Alexander got the ring, he held it up towards the light, and inside he saw two names, Rudolf and Hedwig, intertwined. The British had the Commandant of Auschwitz. They had the man who was responsible for over 1 million people's deaths. Anger then took over. It was claimed that, Hans said, "In 10 minutes I want to have Höss in my car, undamaged," and then walked off. He knew that this made him responsible for what was about to happen, and he was prepared to face the consequences. Rudolf was immediately surrounded by the remaining soldiers, who dragged him to one of the barn's slaughter tables, tore the pyjamas from his body, and beat him with axe handles. Rudolf screamed, but the blows kept coming. After a short period, the doctor spoke to Hans. "Call them off," he said, "unless you want to take back a corpse." Just as suddenly as it had started, the beating stopped. A rough woolen blanket was wrapped around Rudolf's shoulders, and he was then carried out of the barn. An hour after the arrest, Höss was placed back onto a truck, and he was taken to a prison, where he was asked a number of questions. The British soldiers were celebrating, and Höss was in handcuffs, and he was then interrogated. He claimed in his autobiography he was actually beaten with the same whip that he had used at Auschwitz, and that alcohol was forced down his throat to try and make him more loose-tongued. Now, the Commandant of Auschwitz was inside of Allied captivity. He was treated roughly at the time, and even his prison cell was kept below freezing, and his feet allegedly developed frostbite. He was transferred to another British camp at Minden, where he was further interrogated, and Höss later confirmed that his imprisonment was tantamount to torture. He later appeared as a defence witness at the Nuremberg trials for the most senior SS man arrested, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, and he brazenly admitted to his crimes as the Commandant of Auschwitz. He was later extradited to Poland to stand trial in the country of his greatest crimes, and he was sentenced to death. On the 16th of April 1947, Höss was brought back to Auschwitz to be executed within the walls of his former camp, the site where he committed so many atrocities, and he was actually hanged on a specially built gallows. The capture of Rudolf Höss was a planned operation that saw the British succeed in bringing one of the worst war criminals in history to justice. A man who was responsible for the creation of the deadliest concentration camp was the target. Days before his execution, Höss repented for his crimes, acknowledging what he had done, but this was no consolation. Because of his actions, over 1.1 million people had been slaughtered systematically. Höss was the man who introduced the gas chambers. He was the man who introduced the means of torturing prisoners inside terrible cells. He was a man with no redeeming qualities, a mass murderer who was more than comfortable with doing the dirty work himself. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.